back now, Lauren, on the life of Fidel Castro. He took power in 1959 after leading a revolution that toppled a U.S.-backed dictator. He held a firm grip on power and was one of the most controversial and divisive figures of the 20th century and into the 21st century.
Fidel Castro's revolution was fought in the mountains of eastern Cuba, the Sierra Maestra. It began on July 26, 1953, when Castro's rebels attacked an army barracks. After being jailed and exiled in Mexico, Castro hid in the mountains, telling an American journalist once that his struggle would end in Cuba's capital.
We gladly suffer cold and rain and the hardship of life in the mountain. This is only the beginning. The last battle will be fought in the capital. You can be sure.
Castro's promise proved to be true on January 1st, 1959, when Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, who had lost critical U.S. armed support, fled Cuba. Castro, who was born into a privileged Cuban family and studied law at the University of Havana, rode triumphantly into Havana to give his victory speech. He promised an open society, free elections, and claimed to want close ties with the United States.
Tell me, Fidel Castro, are you concerned at all about the communist influence in Cuba?
Oh, I am not worried because really there is not threat about communism here in Cuba.
But Castro's leftist ideology would soon put him on a collision course with the U.S., and it wasn't long before Cuba found itself allied to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In 1961, a force of Cuban exiles attacked Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, but without promised American air cover and no uprising inside Cuba in support of the rebels, the expedition was crushed by Castro's forces.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man.
The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war after Soviet missiles pointed at the U.S. were deployed in Cuba. President Kennedy responded with a naval blockade of the island. Castro's revolution saw thousands of Cuban exiles flee on freedom flights, most of those refugees settling right here in South Florida and never losing their disdain for the bearded dictator who uprooted their lives. Washington retaliated to Castro's ties to the Soviet Union and expropriation of U.S. property in Cuba by imposing an economic embargo against the island and cutting off normal diplomatic relations. Castro's revolution saw an ambitious education program in rural parts of Cuba, expansion of health care throughout the island, and an effort to make racial integration a reality. He wanted to create a new man who was part of a socialist society. But that new society had no room for dissension. Over the years, Cubans have escaped any way they could. 125,000 fleeing on the Mariel boat lift in 1980. And thousands more during the rafter crisis of the 1990s. Castro was never able to achieve economic prosperity in Cuba, even during the many years his economy was subsidized by the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union is a country which has advanced greatly.
The Soviet subsidies ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. Cuba's economy hit rock bottom. Cubans turned to the black market. Prostitution on the streets of Havana, which Castro claimed to have put an end to, flourished as Cubans did anything they could to get their hands on hard currency. In 2002, I interviewed Castro at a trade fair sponsored by American companies eager to do business with Cuba. I asked him if the food he was buying from the U.S. under new exemptions in the embargo was actually getting to the Cuban people or being sold to foreign tourists. I also asked him about the Varela Project, a petition drive to have free elections in Cuba.
¿Qué nos puede decir del proyecto Varela? Por fin, ¿qué va a pasar con ese proyecto?
Bueno, yo creí que usted iba a hablar conmigo sobre el asunto de la feria alimenticia, pero usted está incursionando en el terreno.
Castro did not directly answer the question, something he is very good at. In his later years, he gave up smoking and traded his fatigues from time to time for business suits. In 1998, the man who made Cuba an officially atheist country hosted Pope John Paul II, who urged Castro to allow more religious freedom in Cuba. Castro's health suffered several setbacks over the years. He once fainted in public during a speech. Age quickly rushed to his side, blaming the episode on the intense heat. Then there was this infamous stumble as he walked off a stage, breaking several bones, but appearing on camera only minutes after the mishap. The CIA claims the Cuban leader suffered from Parkinson's disease, but the issue was never addressed by Castro or the state-controlled media in Cuba. Attention was placed on Castro's brother Raul after news on July 31, 2006, that Castro was stepping aside after suffering intestinal bleeding that required surgery. Word of Castro's ill health prompted cheers in Miami, but sadness in other parts of the world. After all, Fidel Castro was a divisive figure, a man who was worshipped as a revolutionary legend by some and despised as a tyrannical dictator by others. Attached to power or not, Fidel Castro once said that history would absolve him. That remains to be seen. And how history will judge him may depend on whether or not his revolution will survive him.
Well, whether or not history will absolve him does remain to be seen. The jury is still out. Here at CBS 4, we've prepared for this moment. We believe it's a pivotal moment in the history of South Florida, which is home to the largest Cuban exile community in the U.S. Cuban Americans have played a key role in South Florida history and have held very strong and passionate feelings about Fidel Castro and what his rule has meant to Cuba and to their lives. And you're seeing it play out live right now at 5:18 in the morning.